Okay, another review tonight on The Franklin Scandal by Nick Bryant. The Franklin Scandal, and I'm not going to be able to do this justice in a short review, but I have several other opportunities to cover some more of this information. So, quick synopsis of the Franklin Scandal. In the late 80s, there was a gentleman by the name of Larry King, not to be confused with the talk show host, the late talk show host Larry King. But this Larry King was a political operative, for lack of a better word, and he ran a credit union in Nebraska, in Omaha, Nebraska. I believe that's right. And when his credit union went belly up because of all the S&L stuff happening in the late 80s, it turned out that he had been doing a lot of weird dealings with the money in the credit union and was operating a prostitution ring, and there's with involving children, and there's all kinds of stuff came out. And there was I believe now, and this is where I'm not going to do this justice. I think it was a Representative DeCamp, John DeCamp, who wrote originally about this, and in his book, which again I'll cover at a later time. But Nick Bryant's book was written, so originally this scandal broke and was really kind of hit the news in the late 80s, like 89 or so. Nick Bryant wrote this book about 20 years later. So I got this book originally in 2010. So this is written long enough after what Nick Bryant refers to in this as a post-mortem. He said there's some cases that are so complicated that really it takes a post-mortem to really dig into it, really figure it out. And he does a great job of that. This is much less sensational than DeCamp wrote a book also about this in the late 80s, just called I think it's called the Franklin Cover-Up or something to that effect. And that's a pretty good book, but not near, I think, the Franklin Scandal by Nick Bryant. He does a much better, more grounded job of researching this, and he's a lot more clear about, hey, I think this author might have been speculating about this part, or there's rumors that this guy was doing this or this or this, but we don't really know that for sure. And I think he's cautious almost to a fault on that, because there's some things I think he probably could have pursued a little bit further, but I also respect the fact that he stayed within the bounds of what he could prove within this book. So really good information, and he goes back and interviews a lot of the key players, a lot of the kids who were involved in this, a lot of the underage children that were involved in prostitution, and goes back and gets them to talk about the story years later. So originally, this is one of those things that was kind of swept under the rug under the auspices of this being a satanic panic kind of thing, which those of us who lived through the 80s, I was a teenager during this time, and I can tell you, while yes, there were people like there are any point in history that get worked up about Satanism and things like that, there were people, even as this stuff was happening, saying, oh, no, that's nothing, that's hysteria over witchcraft or whatever. So that was not a general societal thing. There were people at the time saying, oh, no, that's, not calling it satanic panic, but calling it things like that. So the idea that this was just naive 80s people that couldn't think straight is not accurate at all. There were lots of people very engaged, digging into this stuff even back then. And having worked in the childcare profession in the early 90s, I was exposed to some very strange abuse cases. So I can say without question, there is some sadistic abuse definitely occurs. Organized abuse definitely occurs. And that's what the Franklin Scandal is all about, is basically a prostitution ring run by Larry King. And to get back to that, I know that was kind of a rabbit trail there, but the important thing that is so important in the Franklin Scandal that will really make you reassess the way you view modern democracy and more specifically our republic here is he really gets into how this could be used as a blackmail ring. Like Craig Spence, some of the key players in this, when you look some of these guys up, if you aren't familiar with this and you Google some of these people like Craig Spence and Larry King and see what all is documented that these guys were up to, you will be shocked, because there's some of these people that you'll be surprised that it was not bigger news when it happened. They were obviously, a lot of these guys were being very carefully protected. And the theory goes about the Franklin scandal that basically this was being used to blackmail high-level politicians, that these guys, people like Larry King, were providing children to politicians and key players in politics and business, and then compromising with this later. So getting video, they were luring them to parties where there was a lot of drugs and then underage prostitutes, and then they would videotape these activities and then use it to blackmail these politicians. So these people were essentially owned after they had partaken in these activities. So Franklin scandal is a really good look at that, especially in that it goes back to the case 20 years later. So it's interesting to see what a lot of the people are saying 20 years on, or roughly 20 years on, especially some of the victims in the case that stuck by their story and said, no, that's exactly what happened, and this was not some kind of satanic panic or some kind of crazy hysteria. And the reason the satanic panic language gets used a lot with this case is because that's what several of the victims reported, that they were involved in ritualistic abuse used to control them, used to frighten them and make them believe that if they talked, a sibling or a parent or a foster parent or somebody like that might be killed. There's some really dark stuff in that. I'll stay clear of going into a lot of the details, but if you're into corruption, and more importantly, if you're into understanding how the modern political landscape is and how blackmail can be used to control politicians. Obviously, Nick Bryant doesn't get into all the mechanizations of that and say, hey, I think this guy's being controlled by this or whatever. The bigger picture thing is what you need to take away from this, of seeing how, if you can get these guys compromised, if you can take your state representative, if you can get your governor, if you can get people in Congress, people making big budget decisions, and you can compromise them with underage prostitutes, you could get those people to vote and do things that would normally be against their self-interest because they don't want to be exposed. And anyway, that's what this gets into. This is a hefty book, lots of stuff in here. Again, great, very well written, very well sourced, lots of resources in the back. Can't recommend this enough. If you're into investigating government corruption, you got to get this book. And it's not, this is one of those things too that, that's my one argument with DeCamp's book, is his is more focused at liberals bad, Republicans good. And this is more just about the whole landscape, about the whole situation, the whole system. And he takes a much more unbiased approach to the whole thing. And it becomes very clear that this is something that transcends party lines. And I think that's a really important take-home message to close with, is this kind of corruption of blackmail and child prostitution knows no party lines. So remember that when you're investigating this stuff. Yes, there are politicians on the left and right who will occasionally kick over these rocks and shine a light into that darkness and look at it a little bit. But for the most part, this is not owned by the Republicans or the Democrats. This is both parties can be bought through this kind of blackmail. So real important, eye-opening book to read, Franklin Scandal by Nick Bryant.